be speaking on mental health. And one of the things I want to make clear up front is I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor, but I've been working in applied Adlerian psychology, which I studied in for over 30 years. So I feel like I've been able to really have proven in my own work how to create the safe spaces that really do impact mental health. So it may be a little bit different approach than you might or otherwise around this topic. So I want to go to, first of all, we're going to be talking about mental health, but it's also important to understand what causes mental illness, because mental health is people health. It's social, it's emotional, it's physical health. It's all of those, the wholeness of who we are. And so a lot of our work is based in the work of Alfred Adler, who was a psychiatrist during the time of Freud and Jung, but he didn't get as much press. And I think part of it is because if you really understand what he was teaching and speaking on, you really can't do win-lose anymore, because it really causes this activated inferiority complex. So he was the one that coined the phrase. And for those of you that are familiar with Brene Brown, you might know her work, which is on shame and vulnerability. And that's the same thing really as inferiority complex. So what Adler said about inferiority complex is that when we feel inferior, it starts to rule us. And it gives us this sense that there's something wrong with us and that we can't really live the same kind of fulfillment that it seems like everyone else is living. And it puts us into uninterrupted struggles. And those struggles are within us and they're between us. So a lot of the internal struggles are the symptoms of those are the things that we see in the world. The immense amount of addiction, the immense amount of over-medication for anxiety and depression, the amount of stress, the amount of people who are ill from stress-related diseases, and the amount of people even in the workplace environment that they call it quiet quitting, but it's always been one form or another of disengagement, where people just kind of check out because they're under so much tension and they have that uninterrupted struggle inside. The external struggles are very obvious as well. They're all the win-lose that we see around us, all the righteousness. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm good, you're bad. All the greed and corruption, all of the ways that we do power over and power under, and find excuses to intimidate one another. And it's all of the isms, the ageism, the sexism, the racism, all of those isms come from this root cause, as does war and estrangement, which a lot of people nowadays call cancel culture, where we just reject people wholeheartedly, and all misbehavior. So it really kind of behooves us to be asking, what do we do about this? And what is the cause of it? And what is the antidote for it? So Adler said that one of his primary concepts is that we're social beings. And a lot of people recognize this, that we're hardwired to be in need of belonging and significance. And when we have healthy belonging and significance, we feel 4 core needs are met. The feeling of being empowered, the feeling that I have a voice, that I can influence equity, that I have a say in my life. And as you know, lots of people don't feel they have that. We also need to feel lovable, which is very different than loved. And I can't stress this enough. This is probably the one that had me do this work myself in the first place, because a lot of us are being affected by what is being neglected in us. So when you make someone feel lovable, you're not doing for them or telling them how much you love them. It's not about affection per se. It's about seeing them as a separate person and finding delight in their uniqueness without any desire to fix or convert or heal or change them. So I tried to pick a picture of somebody that just looks like they're delighting in that person in front of them. That is what causes people to feel lovable. I was highly loved as a child, but it felt as if my parents didn't have the skill of actually seeing us and hearing us as separate people. And as a result, they didn't really have curiosity about us, and they really didn't allow us to contribute back or teach them. And that's a really big deal. So I just want you to be aware of that. We also need to feel connected in a healthy way with wherever we are. So I recently have a friend who started a new job, And within the first couple of days, she called me and she said, they even invited me to like a happy hour, but it felt like everybody was very cold and they were in their cliques and I didn't feel very welcomed and I don't think they liked me. And I said to her, I said, can I make a suggestion? And she said, yes. And I said, when you go to work tomorrow, as soon as you walk in the building, I want you to say in your mind, I love this job. I love this place. These people are amazing. I love these people. And I just want you to keep that going in your head. Well, she called me that night and she said, oh my God, it was a completely different workplace. They all warmed up to me. They all made me feel really important and connected. And what is really important is our need for connection is so great that if we don't have a history where it has felt easy or good for us, we'll start setting up a dynamic that we're withdrawing and we're judging, and that starts to interrupt the positive connection that's possible. But it's that important. And we also need to feel that we can make contributions to one another, not just during crisis. But the problem is we're all so stuck in our own inferiority complex that we don't necessarily ask for what we need from people. And we rob them of the opportunity to do things for us and to contribute to us or to contribute to our projects or to our endeavors, because we have this notion that it's better to give than receive. And somehow it's less to receive. And it also feels very vulnerable to receive. So it's really important that you know this. These 4 core needs are so great that imagine a person that is drawn to a gang and the gang says you have to go out and kill somebody to be initiated into our gang. And maybe that person has never felt empowered, lovable, connected, and contributing in sufficient degree. They will override their conscience and their fear of imprisonment in order to be accepted into the gang. And that is how powerful these core needs are. There was a group of people that brought an Adlerian psychology approach into a prison in Florida. And for those of you that don't know, the rate of repeat reincarceration, which is called recidivism, is around 60 to 70% across, at least across the United States. And when they brought in an Adlerian approach where the people, part of what they did was say to the inmates, you're no different than I am. We all want the same things. You thought you had to get these met in a way that wasn't socially acceptable, but the needs themselves are valid, and let's help you find another way to get them met. So they took the inmates out of the monster box and they were able to heal to the degree of 4% recidivism rate. And we see a similar thing in our culture transformation when we look at how do we help people stop hiding their inferiority complex and how do we help them to have the conditions and the conversations where they can start experiencing this antidote instead. So many of you may have heard the phrase psychological safety. Some of you may not know what it means. So I want to talk about it from 2 quick perspectives. One is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He's basically saying once you get your basic needs met for clean water and for food and lodging, then your needs are more emotional and social. And we can't really move forward in a healthy manner until all of those various needs are gratified. And even if we're in an adult body that says, I'm okay, everything's great, we often have a child within us that has not had those safety needs met. And until they're satisfied in the conditions and conversations of all kinds of different environments, they will continue to be functioning and costing us all. So psychological safety is really where you can be in the presence of people and you're not afraid of any negative consequence that's highly harmful to you. Like you're aware that your self-image isn't going to be destroyed, your status, your job. And you're even in a condition where you feel like it's safe to take risks and to make mistakes, and that no matter what, you're going to be accepted and respected. And I think the reality that I see is all people want to be loving and respectful and caring and create such a condition. But a lot of us have not been taught how to, and we haven't been given the support that's needed to actually create all the conditions and conversations for psychological safety. I don't know if you've read these books. In the United States, I know that The Body Keeps the Score has been on the bestseller list for months and months and months. And I'm not sure about the other one, but it should be if it's not. And they're both excellent books about trauma. What I thought was particularly interesting about The Body Keeps the Score is that Bessel van der Kolk, he did so much research that identified a huge amount of trauma is more subtle than we think. It's not the common way that we see trauma is a war veteran or somebody that's been raped or they've seen violence or they've been battered. And those are definitely forms of trauma. But we're also traumatized by the day-to-day things that I'm going to be covering in some of the next slides. And he calls that developmental trauma. And so what happened was he gathered all this research and he tried to get the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the DSM, to accept a diagnosis of developmental trauma because it's so widespread that it needs to be recognized. It's like initially the veterans' trauma was not recognized, and that PTSD is now recognized. But this developmental trauma has not made, crossed the line. And so it goes somewhat unknown, but that's why there's so many people drawn to these books. So what is trauma informed? Trauma informed is an approach where you assume that an individual, and I would say a collective, is more likely than not to have a history of trauma, even if it's a subtle, nuanced trauma. So trauma-informed care means that you're going to set up the environment where you are making sure that you're taking into consideration the role that trauma has played so that you don't inadvertently trigger that trauma or make it worse or cause it to be an inhibitor in the individual or in the collective. So when I have been developing my own organization and we have a scalable system, a friend of mine is a futurist and he's got a master's degree in social work. And he was the one that told me years ago, you have created a trauma-informed model and you have created a model that creates psychological safety. I didn't even know what all of that meant back then, but it is true. And so you want to look for people that understand this and are adapting things to these needs. I want to talk a little bit about unresolved psychological contracts. Unresolved psychological contracts are whenever we have our own idea of what we're entitled to get or receive, and what other people are supposed to be giving us. So it's a lot like assumption. And what happens is when that doesn't jive with us, we'll start leaving or the other person will start leaving before they actually physically leave. And then sometimes by the time you realize there's a problem, it's too late to do anything about it. So I'm going to just give you a quick example. I have 5 children. One of them lived 2 doors down from me. And about 15 years ago, when she had her first child, I was working from home. She was working from home and her water broke. She didn't call me. She went to the hospital with her husband. He came home and took her to the hospital. And I didn't find out the baby was born until the next day, after the baby had been born in the middle of the night. Well, I was so hurt because in my family, everybody called the mom first. It wasn't that the mom had to be in on the birth, but she wanted to be told the labor has started and, and all of that. So I was completely thrown by that. Now, it turned out they had read and taken all these courses on natural childbirth. So they didn't know they were required to give that. And they were taught, keep it all within your little nuclear family and preserve it that way. So they had a whole different idea of what they were entitled to receive and required to give. So the unresolved psychological contracts that we have with people are not in themselves a problem. They become a problem when we don't address them. They remain unresolved. And then we make assumptions and we start name calling and judging motives. And that's where we get into a lot of trouble. And I think a lot of us don't even consider that this is going on all over the place. So part of unresolved psychological contracts are the ways that we inadvertently, in small and large ways, break trustworthiness with each other. So I want to just put your attention on the bottom of this model. This is a model for a responsibility-based workplace culture or framework. And the foundation is what's called trustworthiness. So what trustworthiness means is that everyone learn about these 8 ways to behave with each other. This is how you create safe spaces. And to recognize, gosh, if I look at somebody in my workplace or my home or my neighborhood or my community, and I'm not feeling what's called a 10. So Jack Canfield, who wrote Chicken Soup for the Soul, he would go to his wife every night and he would say, are we at a 10? And what he was really asking her is, do we have anything unresolved? And if she would say, no, we're not a 10, he would say, what number are we? And then she would say, well, we're an 8 or whatever. And he would say, what do I need to do to make it a 10? That was his commitment to her, to have trustworthiness. And she would say something like, well, you didn't take out the trash last night and you said you would. So the value that was being neglected was keeping commitments. And he would be able to say, oh, you're right, I didn't, and I'm so sorry. And I either want to make amends or I at least want to apologize. So when we work with clients, one of the things we're teaching them about making this trust foundational is that every month when they mentor with one another, one of the questions they ask over time is, do you have any relationships that are not a 10? And then they can be self-aware and they can be aware of their relationships and they can decide if they're going to manage those themselves, manage themselves and manage the relationship. I remember recently a consulting company had a couple of consultants. They were very high paid. They were in a big multinational company and they were working on some really important digital projects. And they were so hostile to each other that the client called the consulting company and said, you got to do something about your 2 consultants because they are just really hostile. And it's hard for us to get help from them because of that. So they called me in to meet with these 2 consultants. And the first thing I said was, I want to first find out where you are with your trustworthiness. And of course, because they were unfamiliar with this, they immediately said, we don't want to do that. We just want to talk about the client that we're working with. And I said, no, we're starting here. So I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, I want you to write down individually what number you would give this, the quality of this relationship, explaining that a 10 is nothing unresolved and, a 1 or 2 is like, it's almost hopeless. And one of them gave the relationship a 1 and the other one gave it a 2. And I said to them, it's like you're driving down the highway in a car that's on fire and you would prefer to ignore that. That's what people do until they decide to create the safe place of really paying attention to the trustworthiness before it gets down to a 1 or a 2. Because what happened with them, and it happens with everyone, is once you let it go all the way down to almost hopeless, one of them said, I'm only doing 1 of these things wrong, and the other person's doing 6 of these wrong. And the other person said, no, I'm only doing 2 things wrong, and he's doing 7 things wrong. So we really expand our own virtues, and we also expand the faults of other people. And we really go heavy duty into blaming when we've allowed our trust to go down from a 9 to a 7 to a 4 to a 1. So it's really an important way to really keep that trust high and to learn all the tools to know how to fix what's broken and to learn how to pace yourself that you build it up as quickly as you can, but within reason. Another thing to really understand is, how do we get to a safe, true community with one another? It's important to know these stages. These came from a book called The Different Drummer by M. Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled. I know that was quite some time ago. But The Different Drummer is where these stages to true community were written. The first stage is called pseudo community. It's where we avoid really bringing up anything that we disagree about. In fact, it's a good stage in the very beginning because it's kind of the honeymoon. It's where we're excited about what we like about each other and what we agree on. But if we are doing that to the cost of really addressing where we don't agree, we become fake and inauthentic and boring and uncreative. And what happens if we don't stay in pseudo community is we start to realize that we have differences with people. Now, one option is to go into this stage called chaos. And if we're really triggered in our own inferiority feelings, which most people are most of the time, unless they've undone the systems that cause that, we'll often go into this power struggle where we say, I'm right, you're wrong. And we try to eliminate the differences by control and pressure. And so the whole mindset is, I'm right, you're wrong. None of us like that power struggle. None of us like to be told, you need to think and do it my way. So what do we do instead? We learn how to bypass chaos and to go to a stage called empty. And empty sounds kind of bleak, but it's not bleak. Empty is where we empty ourselves of the need and the willingness to fix and control and convert and heal each other. We empty ourselves of that agenda. And we start to also empty ourselves of things like long-standing prejudices, long-standing hatreds and terrors, and all kinds of things that we don't always know are in us until we're confronted with, am I going to do pseudo community or am I going to do chaos? If I'm going to do empty, I'm going to be confronting what's inside me. And it takes a while to develop the discipline to practice recognition of the other person, receptivity to the other person, respect to the other person, so that they're not an object that we dehumanize, and to disclose ourselves to the other person without the agenda to change anybody. So this is very much what we do when we're helping people feel lovable. We're actually doing recognition, receptivity, respect, and disclosure, and we're doing it mutually. Now, for many people like that, those two consultants that were in that 1 and 2 kind of dynamic, they didn't want to go here. They were like, no, we just want to pass that, right? They needed to do this in order to have this, to really move into true community. So in empty, it feels a little passive, and it feels to some people like it's a waste of time. It's not. It is so what is missing in our society today. And it is so at the root of the inferiority complex being perpetuated, because there's an arrogance about trying to fix and convert and heal each other. There's a humility and a respect and an honoring when we move toward empty. Then we can actually get to true community, where 4 other of the trust values are played out. And those are the hardest ones. It's really hard for people to be straight with each other. It's hard to be honest no matter what. And it's often hard to follow through and seek excellence when you have bad feelings toward each other. Then you just are not engaging. You're doing all of those things that are in that inferiority, those 2 lists. So true community can go very quickly. It can be super efficient, super effective, and it is the safe place. But it often means that you have to build that sense of respect and trust with each other. Social interest is something that's equally important to safe places. Social interest is a term that was also coined by Alfred Adler, and it's really about people recognizing the importance of kinship with each other and community with each other. And I know that sounds like a duh to many people, but a lot of the time we're not even developing the individual very well, much less helping that individual become aware of what we're causing one another. So when you see this word consequences, if someone were to say to you, there will be consequences, I would imagine if we could talk about it, you would say what most groups say. Oh, consequences brings an image to my mind that something bad's going to happen to me. Oh, there will be consequences. That's how we've all heard the word. But consequences should be something that we consider, wow, I can use my power to cause consequences. How will I cause them? What will I cause? So I had a day one time I was at the grocery store and I saw this little 5-year-old or 4-year-old ask his mom, why can't we park in this spot right by the front door? Nobody's parked here. And she said to him, and this made me really sad. She said, see that $500 on the sign? That means that a policeman could come. If we parked here, we could get in trouble and they might take our car away and we'd have to pay money to get it back. And that to me was so sad, because it's all about the consequences that would have happened to him if he was the adult. And so what I wish she would have said is, you know what, here's the deal. We are such a caring community that we watch out for each other. And that means that we pay attention that there are some people that can't walk like we can walk. And we accommodate them because of our love for one another. That is social interest. And I just want you to know that I was taught social interest at the cost of being an individual. I was taught it before I was a solid individual. It's very important that both things happen simultaneously, that you are rigorously helping a person know their worth and value, and that they are empowered, lovable, connected, and contributing, all while they are co-creating that for others. If you don't have those two together, you're really going to end up with something that is not safe spaces.
And there was a social experiment where they took handicap signs and they put a photo of a real handicapped person, and it said, "Thank you for saving this space for me." And then they videotaped those spots, and people that normally would pull in and park there thinking they're probably not going to get caught, they would see that sign and they'd pull out and park somewhere else. And as soon as they remove those pictures, people would park there illegally again. So it's really important that we start teaching social interest. The importance of individuality matters, but so does this social interest in the community. And when we don't have both, we will cause mental illness and we will have a lack of mental health.
Also, it's very important to know the difference between a working group and a team. And this is a more subtle way that we're either creating a safe place or a very safe place. Most people would say a team is a group of people, like imagine that's all of us, and we're all committed to achieving an important goal, and all the lines to the goal are an indicator that we're all in, we're all committed. And if I asked you, is this a team? There may be some of you that would say, yeah, that sure sounds like a team. We call that a working group. It's definitely something like a team, but an actual team is where you're focused on all the people that are involved in this endeavor. And you're making sure that you're watching for, is everybody experiencing wild success? I remember when I first learned this model, it was very humbling for me because in my inferiority complex, my way of reacting to it was to try to prove that I was better than everybody and that I was really good. And I would even kind of step on people or definitely not pay attention to whether they were successful. And this was something that when I heard this definition, it really called to my heart, that deeper part of us that doesn't want to come from limiting beliefs and fears. And I was grateful to recognize, oh, this is that social interest where I'm thinking about myself, but I'm also thinking about all of the people that are involved here. And imagine if you had a commitment to this definition of team, how safe the environment would feel on a day-to-day basis. Here's another phrase by Adler that I love it that I found this disgusting picture. But Adler said, spitting in your soup is a way that we take something that is collectively believed to be wholesome and we make it unappealing to the point that possibly some of you or all of you may, if you recognize, oh, this is soup I thought was okay, maybe you'll be disgusted enough or question it enough to be willing to put it aside for something different, because it's very much a part of what I believe is at the root of inferiority complex and mental health issues largely. And it's the way we use control. So we have various systems that I'm going to go into in a minute, but I want to talk about control in general. In an organization, it could even be in a family. If it's a family, it might not be profit, but it would be compliance. I just want you to do what I say. In an organization, it might be profit is everything, and you're just a cog in the wheel, which is treating you transactionally. And it's definitely top down and external motivation. That's why I love this picture of somebody pulling the puppet strings. That's what external motivation is. And what we settle for when we use control is compliance, not commitment. So here are some ways we do control. One is called command and control in workplaces, but it's also just the do what I say or else. It's do it or I'm going to sick your dad on you or whatever it is, depending on what environment you're in. The belief you're holding about people is that you can't be as trusted as me, and my job is to manage you using commands and management. And it sounds reasonable, especially if you're in a business and you have the title manager. But the whole accountability is you do what I say or else. So what you cultivate, you're trying to cultivate compliance, but what you cultivate is resentful compliance, which is like C- work instead of A+ work. Or you really tick people off and they say, no, I won't, you can't make me, and they rebel and resist. Another one is a surprise to people. It's actually a control tactic to dangle carrots in front of people and say, I'll give you this if you do that. What you're believing is that without me inducing you and motivating you, you're selfish and lazy. And I really want to do whatever I have to do to get you to jump through my hoop. But what most people don't realize is that when you use incentives, you rob a person of the actual joy they have for the thing that you want them to love. So for example, if I had a kid and I said, I'm going to pay you $1 for every book you read, what his research showed, a man named Alfie Kohn, what his research showed is that that child will be less in love with reading if you use incentives that way. Because there's a part of us that knows it must really suck to read if they have to pay me to do it. And also, we don't like the feeling of being manipulated. We don't like the feeling that somebody believes we're selfish and lazy. and that they think they have to, finagle us to do something. It also, in a business, it also sets up a competition often for a limited resource or reward. And so people become more self-centered and competitive, and they'll rush past quality. Now, I just want to pause here for a second on these two control models, because this is soup that is widely promoted, widely endorsed. This is the kind of soup people will say, well, I was spanked and it didn't hurt me. Or, yeah, I can really get my people to snap in place if I just, give them a bonus or whatever. And it works. I want you to know it works, but it works at a very high price tag. And that's the thing most of us don't recognize. It's feeding back into the inferiority complex because we're holding limiting and fearful beliefs, but we don't catch that part. So we keep eating that soup. Now, this is another control tactic. It's kind of like the verbal version of quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. This is where somebody is assuming and presuming that I'm more deserving than you are, and therefore I have the right to bestow my judgment on you. Now, my judgment could be, you've made me proud, go make me proud. Or it could be, oh, I'm so disappointed in you. But when we're bestowing that judgment, the intention is, you're supposed to please me. That's the goal, please me. So what you create are people who become brown nosers and people pleasers, and they're not honest. They're doing pseudo community, or they get ticked off and think, who died and made you God? And then they rebel and resist because they don't like that feeling of being judged, even favorably, they don't like it. There's another one that surprises people, and it's the most dangerous, believe it or not. It's more dangerous than even being, beaten and things like that, which is bad. And it's when we pamper and spoil people. It's when we make assumptions about them that they're incapable, that they can't do, that we hover and enable and overcompensate for them. And we have this belief that it's just going to turn them into this responsible, more engaged person. And it really doesn't. In fact, what it does is, you want to remember this saying, what you pamper, what you rescue, you make weak. And the reason this is so costly is because when you start conditioning somebody that they're incapable, they will believe you. And they become incapable, and they become rigid in that incapability. And I've been in organizations where I'll ask the people, what is the one that your C-suite does the most? And often, the CEO is doing quadrant 4, and they don't like it. And the reason these are harmful to us and they cause mental illness is because it's the puppet strings. It's, I'm going to do everything. You sit back and just do what I want from you. So notice all the beliefs across the board are limited and fearful, and all of the results are less than ideal. So Einstein said this quote. He said, we can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And that quote could go for lots of different things, but I want you to think about it with the soup that I just spit in. If we're thinking those negative limiting thoughts in order to use those control tactics, why would we want to keep going back to them? We will if we don't realize that's the soup that's making us sick. And it's even making us sick in the way we treat our children, the way we treat our children in homes and in schools and in the community. And we don't recognize it. So we keep doing the same thing over and over again. So I just really ask you to consider, why would we keep the same thinking and the behaviors that go with that thinking? So what do we do instead? So when you're focused on building responsibility within people, and in our model, it's everybody from top to bottom. By the time my kids were 5 years old, they all knew how to run a family meeting because I wanted them to feel empowered. I wanted them to feel lovable, connected, and contributing. And there were lots of ways we did that. So when you create a responsibility-based community or safe space, people are important. You have a conviction and a commitment to their development and to the purpose within each person. And instead of being transactional with people, we're relational with people. We treat them as though they matter in and of themselves, not for what they can do for us. And instead of having a hierarchy and a top-down, win-lose, power over power under dynamic, it's on the human level, it's shared power. There might be different roles and distinctions in the skills of the business or organization or parenting, but there's shared power around certain behaviors that everybody gets to be part of. And it's all about developing internal or intrinsic motivation, not the puppet strings. And you go for commitment, not compliance. So what does that look like? In this model, Again, whether it's in your home, your school, your community, a police department, a workplace, anything, the belief you hold about people is that they are great or they want to be great. And if they're not acting great, the assumption is what system needs to be put in place in order for these four core needs to be met adequately. It's not who's to blame, why is this happening? It's what system needs to be put in place so that the greatness that is untapped is allowed to be tapped. And that's a completely different kind of belief than in the control models. The goal of leaders is that everyone becomes mentored regularly. They get feedback, they get support, they get moved from awareness into self-management and awareness in relationships to managing those relationships. And it's called the accountability. Instead of being accountable to me, the big bad boss, whether it's, again, personal or professional, everybody's taught how to own what's theirs to own. And by that, we mean everybody learns how to manage their relationships, their productivity, their engagement levels, their purpose, their values, their visions, everything. And that is not something the leaders do. It's that the leaders make sure it is instilled within a system, even if it's brother and sister helping each other to learn those skills. What you cultivate are people that become self-managing. They show up with their A game, which right now, with quiet quitting in organizations, that's most of the people. Gallup has been saying this for years, that 70% approximately of people are disengaged, doing C- work, or they're radically disengaged, where they are causing sabotage, gossip, coming in late, really mucking things up. So that only leaves about 30% of people that are really showing up this way. And the reason this is so strikingly different is because it's all about developing people from the inside out. So even though I showed you the four control models, if we had time, I would show you what are the intrinsic motivators. Because if I take one bowl of soup away, if you don't have another bowl, and it's beyond even those intrinsic motivators, it's a whole bunch of things, you're going to go back to the old soup. That's just the way we are. We go to what we know, and we've known it for centuries. So it takes real committed effort to shift to this type of a structure and safe place. One of my favorite quotes by Fred Rogers, he was a famous American television host of a children's program. And he's widely loved and known in the United States. And this quote is, if you could only sense how important you are to the lives of those you meet, how important you can be to the people you may never even dream of, there's something of yourself that you leave at every meeting with another person. And so, we're so used to popping pills for mental health that we forget that it's one another that is the medicine most of the time. I do this work because it helps me with my mental health. And I want you to understand the power of that medicine, which is in you.